Greetings, book lovers, and get ready for a literary adventure that will ignite your imagination. Join me as we traverse the captivating landscapes of Malone Dies by Samuel Beckett. Your support as a viewer means everything to me. If you're enjoying what you're seeing, please show your appreciation by liking this video and hitting that subscribe follow button. And if you have any questions or ideas, I'm all ears in the comments. Section 1. Much like its predecessor, Malone Dies begins with an unnamed narrator in unknown circumstances who declares, "I shall soon be quite dead at last, in spite of all 173. Even though the reader is not told his identity until later in the novel, that the narrator is an old man named Malone, for purposes of clarity, the narrator will be referred to as Malone from the beginning. Speaking in first person, Malone says that he could will himself to die by making a little effort, but might as well let it happen without rushing things. He insists, however, that he must guard themselves against throes without specifying what these are. 173. The one thing that is established is that Malone is waiting to die, and in the midst of his waiting, he will tell themselves stories, initially 4, then declares that only 3 will be told. Malone muses on the desire to be clear despite the pressure of incoming death, and thinks that if he succeeds in the telling, he will then create an inventory of his possessions. Malone then examines his present state. He is bedridden in a room and, lacking a better explanation, concludes that it must be his own. Turning to describe his physical condition, Malone notes that he is very old, perhaps an octogenarian. He also claims he is toothless. An unidentified they brings the narrator food, which is always soup, and has poor sight and hearing, leading him to conclude that his body is impotent, noting that there is virtually nothing it can do. 179. Turning to the story, the narrator introduces a boy called Saposcat, whose friends call him Sapo. Malone describes him as precocious, despite not doing well in school, and turns to describing his parents, who, despite being poor and sickly, were always attempting to surmount their circumstances, but their plans never led to anything. 180. Sapo's parents are bent on having a garden, despite lacking the money or health to properly maintain it. They also seem to be unsatisfied with their son. Malone notes that they did not know why he was committed to a liberal profession, and instead preferred to think of him as a doctor so that he could take care of them in their old age. 180. After reflecting on his own capability to tell Sapo's story, Malone claims that though Sapo was never alone, his friends did not exactly love him. 183. As a schoolboy, Sapo spent most of his time engaged in school activities, but exhibited a penchant for disobeying his teachers. Malone describes Sapo's appearance at 14 as plump and rosy, with thick ankles and a big round head hoared with flaxen hair as stiff and straight as the bristles of a brush. 184. He took an interest in nature, despite being unable to integrate his interest in any sort of rational understanding of the natural world. The narrator also notes that Sapo had little interest in dating and was more fixated in dreaming of the kind of life he wanted to have in the future. Malone's musings begin to interlace with descriptions regarding Sapo's childhood. Reflections on the pointlessness and tedium of existence weave into an account of Sapo's despair at being unable to discern what manner of being he was and how he was going to live. 187. Yet Malone also relays trivial things, such as the fact that Sapo took private lessons during summer holidays. Malone wonders whether it is possible to find a way to live that aligns with his inclinations, but admits that he says living without knowing what it is, and that words themselves are insufficient to his embody His thoughts on the matter, 189. He also mentions that he is concerned with another whom he wishes to speak about, but feels that he does not know how to do so. Malone begins to rummage through his things, wanting to ensure that he has no uncertainty about them, and in order to determine what exactly remains in his possession, part of his desire to form an inventory before he dies, 190. Expressing fears about running out of time and dying on a final note of misery, he speaks of the desire to have his last waves of thought express living as its theme, 192. Section 2. Malone turns to narrating the life of the Lambert family, which consists of a mother and father with 2 children that live at a homesteading farm. He calls the father Big Lambert, describing him as a toothless bleeder and disjointer of pigs, who was highly in demand over the actual butcher because of his low fee, which was often just a request for some of the meat, 194. Big Lambert's wife is afraid of him, and Malone notes that he beats her. The son he describes the son as a great strapping lad with terrible teeth, 195. Though he is mostly prone to silence, the rare occasions that Big Lambert makes conversation involves the differences and similarities between the pigs he slaughters. Sapo spends time at the Lamberts' farm, mostly observing them carry on their daily activities. Malone does not specify how he came to know them, just that he comes in and out of the farm, often without giving them any notice. Malone pauses the story and listens to the noises of the world which, due to his old age, have fused into one vast, continuous buzzing. 201. He describes some of his surroundings and says that he does not want to write, but feels that he must in order to know where he has got to, though it is unclear whether he refers to Sapo or that unnameable other he has previously mentioned. 201. He talks about the exercise book that he is writing in and mentions that it just appeared in his possessions, despite his claim that he knew that he did not have one. The pencil he writes with, in contrast, is an old acquaintance that he hopes will see him out to the end of his life. 203. Turning back to Sapo, Malone notes that his parents were hoping that their son would achieve academic success at either medicine or law. Yet Sapo is not depicted to be studying for anything, and instead spends time at the Lamberts' farm. One day, he goes to visit them and finds Big Lambert and his son, now given the name Edmund, burying their dead mule, so Sapo proceeds to observe them carrying out the task. Returning from obtaining lentils for supper from a neighbor, Mrs. Lambert begins to sort through them to remove any pebbles or other materials, though midway into the task she becomes frustrated and gives up. Sapo reflects on the futility of her task and whether completing it would have had any tangible effect. Mrs. Lambert then cooks a lentil soup with rabbit and after the meal and feeds her family. Malone notes that Edmund and Mr. Lambert have incestual feelings towards the daughter, but have not acted upon them. Malone digresses to narrate that he once sought the advice of an Israelite named Jackson on the subject of conation. He also says that Jackson had a talking parrot that could only utter the first 3 words of a Latin aphorism, 211. Malone notes that his relationship with Jackson was short because the latter found him disgusting, 211. After musing on his impotence, whether he is actually still alive, and the darkness of his room, Malone is cut off mid-sentence because he loses his pencil and only recovers it after 48 hours, 216. Section 3. After finding his pencil and losing 2 days in the process of searching for it, Malone muses on its diminishing size due to overuse. Even though he says he has another pencil from France, he worries that he will lose his current one. During the process of searching for his pencil, Malone claims that it seemed as if the dimensions of the room had changed shape and the walls and floor had begun to pale in color. 216. Dropping his exercise book, he uses his stick to retrieve it and feels his thoughts streaming and emptying away as through a sluice. 217. He begins to reflect on the absurdity of his situation, the variability of feeling and existence more broadly, and whether there is a real difference between life and death. He considers that he may have had some semblance of a life once, one where he knew Jackson and wandered in nature and had a desire to live, but concludes that regardless of whether he lived or not, he shall go on doing as he has always done. 219. After these reflections, Malone turns back to Sapo, but renames him to McMahon after expressing distaste at his former name. Malone recounts in detail his greatcoat that covers him completely. He describes the arrangement of the coat's buttons, its bottom fringe, and its cab. Green color. 221. McMahon lingers here near some docks in an unnamed city where he watches passersby. He sees a horse-drawn cab and its driver and muses on their mutual dejection. The horse, because it mostly cannot move, and the driver of the cab for the lack of passengers. Malone depicts McMahon as frozen in this scene, which might be a true spring evening or might be autumn, but notes that he must at some point carry on, because in order not to die, you must come and go. 225. Intuiting that his death is approaching, Malone begins to feel disconnected from his body, particularly his feet and hands. He wonders what will happen if he ever stands up again, but concludes that it is better to lie down so that no one notices him. Considering his imminent death, he contends that all will finally be over with the Murphys, Merciers, Malloys, Morans, and Malones, and Malone's 229. He also wonders how many people he has killed and concludes that there must be at least 5, all unknowns. 209. Caught in a rainstorm, McMahon decides to lie flat on the ground, face down, based on the reasoning that at least the front surface area of his body will stay dry. Due to the prostate position of his body, he begins to think about the concept of punishment, but Malone notes that he had confused the ideas of guilt and punishment in his mind. 233. Thinking that the rain must end soon, McMahon wonders whether he should have continued walking despite not knowing where he is or where he is going. He flips onto his back and wonders whether the rain is the cause of his sufferings or whether it is due to a series of different causes. Malone claims that McMahon had to survive day by day completely on his own, which was made more difficult by the fact that he was not good at working due to absent-mindedness and a poor sense of locomotion. Growing restless, McMahon turns over to his side and begins to roll with regularity and rapidity, dreaming that he could exist in a flatland as a cylinder where he could roll infinitely and never have to stand up again. 239. Section 4. Turning away from McMahon's story, Malone begins to worry about his possessions. His 2 pencils, his exercise book, and his stick, which he notes only became his when he arrived at his current location. He considers some of his other things, including a needle wedged in a cork and a tobacco pipe whose stem had broken off. Malone wonders why he kept the pipe, considering that he does not use one, nor is it operable, but wonders whether if it could be because of that foul feeling of pity has so often felt in the presence of things, and goes on to conclude that the objects he keeps function as a form of mutual consolation. 241. He goes through some of his other items, a bowl that he kept things in, a club stained with blood, a single boot, a photograph of an ass, a donkey, and his hat without a brim. Despite speaking about his objects in detail, Malone wonders whether his inventory is rooted in fact. I feel I am perhaps attributing to myself things I no longer possess and reporting as missing others that are not missing others that are not missing. 243. Turning to his current state, Malone worries that he might die of hunger, for his pot that is normally refilled with soup has been empty for days. He expresses the desire to die of old age, pure and simple, without any medical intervention to keep him alive past his time. 246. The anonymous they that feed Malone do not seem to visit him anymore. In the beginning, there was an old woman, then just a yellow arm, and finally a yellow hand, to which Malone concludes that they were probably agents of a consortium. 246. The romantic feelings between them, however, begin to dissipate. Malone describes McMahon's feeling for Mole as frankly one of repugnance and hypothesizes that Mole had concluded that he was not the man she had taken him for. 256. Yet, after noticing Mole's earrings, two crucifixes representing the two thieves crucified with Jesus, and the Christ in her mouth, a crucifix of Jesus carved on her tooth, she rose with a bound in his affections. 257. Mole, however, becomes sick. She begins to smell, her complexion sallows, and has bouts of vomiting, and thus begins to distance herself from McMahon, who assumes that her change in behavior is due to her not having feelings for him anymore. One morning, a man named Lemuel comes to McMahon and tells him that Mole has died and that he will be taking care of him hereafter. Section 5. McMahon asks Lemuel questions about his circumstances at St. John of God's, such as whether the institution is a hospice for the aged and infirm or a madhouse, and whether he has the possibility of ever getting out. But Lemuel does not answer. He ruminates on the question for so long and eventually replies that he does not know the answers. After Lemuel, who enjoys self-inflicted pain, deals himself a blow with a hammer on his previously wounded leg, McMahon demands that he let him get out of his bed. Back in the present, Malone claims that someone visited him in his room and dealt him a violent blow on the head. 262. The man in question wore a black suit of antiquated cut with oily black hair and a long, dismal, glabrous flowery face. 262. Malone notes that he thought the man was the undertaker and that he stayed several hours before leaving, returned, and then left again. He just watched Malone in his bed, and he appeared to be talking, but Malone could not understand nor speak himself due to his aphonia. Not knowing who or why the man was in his room, Malone writes 21 questions in his exercise book and reproduces them on the page. They range from 1, "Who are you?" to 12, "Why has my soup been stopped?" 265. Finally able to go outside, McMahon spends increasingly more time in the grounds of St. John of God's, to the point where his keepers threaten to reprimand him if he does not return. Lemuel, however, always knows where McMahon is, in a bush where he had made his lair, and though Lemuel often spends time with him in the bush, he also calls upon a keeper named Pat to beat McMahon with a stick. 268. While he spends time outside, McMahon looks for ways to escape but finds it not feasible. Lemuel receives a notice from Lady Petal, the institution's manager, to take 5 of the inmates on an excursion to a nearby island on Easter Sunday to look at Druid remains. Lemuel orders 6 excursion soups from the kitchen, which just means the regular soup fortified with bacon, and he proceeds to remove each piece and suck the fat off it before throwing the rinds back into the soup. 274. Malone interrupts the story to relay that the end for him has arrived, a birth into death. 276. Immediately switching back, the 5 inmates prepare to leave for the trip. A thin one, carrying an umbrella, A youth, the Saxon, who Malone notes is not one, but giant. And McMahon, 276, Lemuel, Lady Petal, the director, or his associate, and Ernest and Maurice, two Colossi dressed in sailor suits, are also present 207 270. 7. They board a wagon, and Lady Petal begins to sing a worship song. The group board a boat and head towards the island to look for a picnic spot near the Druid remains. The Saxon, who is chained to the giant, refuses to leave the boat. Lemuel holds on to McMahon by the waist. Without warning, Lemuel releases McMahon and murders Maurice with a hatchet and does the same to Ernest. Lady Petal, who has gone ahead, turns around and, noticing the dead sailors, faints and falls to the ground. Lemuel makes McMahon, the thin one, and the youth return to the boat where the Saxon and the giant remain, and they set off from the shore. Far out into the bay, all of them, save for Lemuel, lie together in a heap. In the night, 280. Lemuel raises the bloody hatchet, and the story breaks off onto disjointed sentence fragments. It concludes with the assertion that he will not hit anyone in war, either with the hesha, his hammer, his stick, his fist, or with his pencil. Enor, 281.